right. We find here in Colossians chapter 2, beginning verse 16, that we have Paul entering a more direct kind of description of the problem. He introduced this beginning in verse 8, and he called it philosophy. Okay, it's important for us to understand that what we call philosophy today is not exactly the same as what they called philosophy. Theirs was a broader idea. And that we saw that it was very much connected in with Judaism, and that in the verses that follow, particularly verses 11 through 15, which we looked at last time, is how Jesus came and did away with that. And you saw all these different references, not just to the law. You have circumcision in verse 11, you have the law in verse 14, but also to all these, he says, principalities and powers. We're going to notice something this week about that. But it says he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in it. A complete victory in showing that he is superior and that you shouldn't turn to them for anything. Okay? And that had that background of these teachers that they were having problems with in Colossians. It does not mean that the Colossians, that it was a big problem internally, but that Paul's wanting to prevent that from taking seed and taking the Colossians off course. And that's what we're going to find as we begin now to see how this belief, this series of ideas that was about Judaism, but that's, as we see, more than just what we think of being Judaism. And we're going to discuss that a lot today. And now it's going to how they tried to implement it, how it affected the Colossians. So let's read verse 16 and 17. So let no one judge you in food or in drink, or regarding a festival, or a new moon, or Sabbaths, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ. The first thing I want you to note is when he says so, and it's therefore in the Greek, do not let anyone judge you. So that immediately is going to bring up, here's where the problem was manifesting itself. That means then that these previous ideas that he had dealt with in verses 8 through 15, that he had addressed these ideas and countered the ideas, showing that Jesus is superior in all of them, and therefore there's no reason to follow them. But here's how it was manifest itself. They were judging these Colossians in some manner. They were telling people in Colossians that you have to do this. Or there are a lot of ways you can do that. You can say, if you were really spiritual, or if you really want to please God, you do this. He'd already addressed the circumcision issue, but notice what is included just in verse 16. And the separation is going to be important here. Okay? What he finds. But in verse 16, he puts it in two categories. Let no one judge you in food or drink. That's the first one. Okay? That kind of general kind of saying, sometimes people go here and now we make it, I can eat and drink whatever I want. That misses the entire point and context of this, and I'd say some other passages of Scripture. Okay? It is within a context of Judaism, particularly, and trying in some way to push that off and require that of others. So when it says, let no one judge you in regarding or in terms of food or in drink, it's essentially the dietary laws. Don't let someone get on to you for who these specifically now Colossian Gentile Christians for not following and being kosher. Don't let somebody bug you about that and act like that means you're not really a Christian. Remember that is part of the theme we're seeing here. The first thing that Paul dealt with about that they'd kind of been attacked, you're not really a Christian, they hadn't been taught by an apostle. Remember we already covered that? So everything was about downgrading them making them feel less than. All right? Now, it may not have happened to you spiritually, but you know people that can just try to indicate you're less than in some ways. And it could be because you didn't go to all the right schools, right? I'm not going to name names here because y'all might less than me. Okay, but if you don't go to all the right schools, or you didn't have all of this in your pedigree, okay, that was part of the issue. Well, one of the things here that they're then saying is that, well, you're not. You can't claim to really be spiritual and be pleasing to God when you're just eating whatever. I mean, bacon, really? Gonna have pork? See? Okay, all these different things. So that was part of it. The second part, though, is seen in or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbaths. And what is the key element about all three of those? What ties those together? Okay, I heard, that's what I heard. Okay, mainly different festivals, okay, you'd have different times where they would stop at holidays, if you will, where they stop doing things. One would be a festival, they'd have a feast, right? When you say it has festival, but the idea of a feast, you're going to have does a Gentile need to keep the Passover or Pentecost or? Okay, so they had those. Sabbaths, okay, so that was what you did if you were a Jew. New moons, we're not as familiar with new moons, but you do see this, particularly I think in maybe Ezra is where we run into it, but where you have extra things going on, you have certain things, sacrifices, when you have a new moon, that'd be the first of the month then, okay, so you'd have something. But these were all Jewish, essentially, holidays of some sort. And so there was the expectation that, well, you don't even keep these. So you have the idea of Judaizing going on, though it's more than Judaizing, okay? It's more than Judaizing. That's what we're going to see is this is one component to the problem that they're seeing. So it showed itself in the dietary laws and the keeping of the feast days, the holidays, Sabbaths. Okay? And so they were being judged by that. So they're looking out and said, basically being made to feel badly and not as spiritual, not pleasing to God, because they did not keep these. Okay? But now, in order to counter that, what does he do in verse 17? He gives it, again, he comes back with perspective. The same way as what he did with circumcision in terms of that's what you did as a Jew in order to be under the old covenant. Well, if you want to be under the new covenant, you need to be baptized. So that's how he did it. Well, now he's giving a core idea to this when he says in verse 17, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ. So since in verse 15, Jesus has already triumphed over all these people and ideas, teachers and stuff, you shouldn't worry about anybody judging you about it. That's the first thing. And then he comes back and says, here's the relationship they actually share. Okay? It's shadow and substance. Now, that's an illustration, essentially, but I want us to think through it. When it says, which are a shadow of things to come. That fact, that statement right there explains why he's going to separate some things. Because these feasts and the dietary laws were part of a law given by God, right? So they were part of what he had put into the old law that then pointed to, ultimately, Christ. And that's what this idea of a shadow or substance was. It says, they're the shadow. Okay. The easiest way, I'm going to say, if the easiest way to explain the difference is why you get what's substance mean versus shadow. Well, if you're going to have a steak, do you want a steak from the substance of the steer or from his shadow? Because one's going to leave you really hungry still, right? A shadow, the good thing is it's no calories. It's also no meat, okay? That's the nature of the illustration he's making. That's not the real thing, okay? The idea but it came before. I want you to think of it this way. If you are on the side of a building, there's a corner, and you are kind of off down the side a little bit on a building, and the sun is coming. Okay, so I'm going to try to do it while you're looking at it, okay? You're at the corner's down there, it turns, and you look over there, and you can see, because the sun is coming from this direction, and I'm going to confuse everyone online, okay? And you see a shadow, and the shadow starts out, and then it's moving this direction. What are you going to immediately conclude? Somebody's there, and they're approaching. Are you going to confuse the shadow with the person of what is real? Okay. That's the way in which he's illustrating here what the things of the old law were. And they were, he says, prioritizing the shadow. All these things about the old law that were in the dietary aspects of it and the feast days were pointing forward to something else. Now, I won't go into length about it here, but if you recall, the nature of the old law was all built upon going back to the promise to Abraham, which itself was built upon the seed promise made to Adam and Eve in Genesis 3:15. But that promise to Abraham in Genesis 12 and verse 3 promised three things. It promised a nation, it promised a land, and it promised seed for salvation. They received and became a nation as promised. They came out of Egypt, a nation. He took them into Canaan, and they received the land. As Joshua recorded, they got all the land that God promised them. So they got the nationhood, they got the land. But there was still the seed promise. And the seed promise was for salvation, through whom all nations of the earth would be blessed. Now the Jews, in the intervening time, turned it around to be about the seed was about them. Okay? And they lost track of what it was really all for, which goes back to Genesis 3:15, and providing for the salvation of mankind spiritually. So that's why all of this was still pointing forward, which was ultimately toward the Messiah. Everything then that we found in the old law was a training ground for holiness, for trust, for faith, all these things. And so that's what these were at that time. But they weren't what God really wanted the whole time. There was something of greater substance to it. Now, Christ is the substance. He is the core, you'd say the real deal, okay? So when you look at this, it is the substance is the body. Okay, so the shadow in the body. But now let's look at verse 18. And this is where it gets interesting. I mean, to me, I should always add that as a caveat. Okay. Which they were or they are. Because it's present tense in the Greek, but that does not mean, it doesn't give them that. It still functions that way in a sense. If they're continuing on with them. That's what they are right now. They're just a shadow. He's showing them and intentionally trying to show that they are less. That if you've got these two choices, this choice is a shadow. This choice is substance. So he's dealing with the present problem is probably the reason why. Now, let's look at verse 18. I want you to notice something parallel. He had already said, do not judge. Okay, do not let anyone judge you. But notice what he does in verse 18. Let no one cheat you of your reward. Now that's a different word. It's a stronger word, and it's a more specific word, but it's related in thought. It is the idea, essentially, okay, of being ruled against by an umpire or an official. And the context is unfairly, right? Which I know everybody who ever played sports thinks that every time that the officials call something, it goes against them, that it's, he's wrong. But I want you to think about, there are times in which that's really the case, where he blew it. And sometimes when you think that, well, he did that deliberately. That's the idea he's got here of you're letting somebody else, you're giving them authority to determine for you whether or not you are winning or not, essentially, spiritually. And so it's a parallel to what was said in verse 16. But why split it up? Why not just list all the things in verse 18 along with the ones in verse 16? Because the ones in verse 16 are about the law, and the ones in verse 18 are things that are additional to the law that these people were bringing in. Now let's know what they are. Let no one cheat you of your reward. That's one word, by the way. Reward isn't even there. It's just no one act as an umpire against you. Okay? They're coming in and they're saying you're out. I had all sorts of illustrations, but I'm not sure everybody here would get them. No offense to you, but I'm not sure how many people want to go back in the 70s football to get that. So when you look at this, it says one of the things is, and all what follows, and it's harder to see this in the English, but what you're going to have is a series of participles. Okay? And the first one is taking delight in false humility and worship of angels. And this is the word is actually wishing or desiring by means of lowliness and a religion of angels. Okay? So religion is different than worship, in that it's kind of a systematized kind of thing, more than the outward expression. That's key, I think, in understanding what is going on here, because we're going to get our clues about what these people were saying from all of this. The first thing is the idea of the humility here, and that does everyone do like the New King James has false humility? It's implied in the context. Voluntary, yeah. It's like thing is that you're thinking that you're showing how humble you are by this. It says that's not what's going on. Because in this sense, if you can imagine, if I'm exalting and spend all my time talking about how great angels are, and this is my attempt to show how I'm humble, but at the same time, you're giving all your attention to angels and not to God. That's not humility. Okay, because if you're inventing things and doing things God has not ever said, and making that a basis about what you're about, that's not humility, because you're not submitting to God. The second part, so the first idea is these ideas somehow involved them teaching something about angels. That's the first thing. The second idea is, which he describes here, is intruding, and this is the last thing, is which things he has not seen. And I want everyone to note that when I said which has not seen, I want everyone to look at your Bible right now, because a lot of your Bibles are going to say which he has seen. That's a textual variant. That means some texts have not in the original, may is the word, and some don't. Okay? So we have to be able to understand it either way. But and this is a tough word. that is intruding or maybe investigating, depending on how you take it. It's a really hard word. Okay, how could you intrude into things which you have seen? What are the things that you have seen religiously? What is it talking about? Paul says, which he has not seen. But again, or, depending on your translation, into things he has seen. Well, what's he talking about either way? What now? No, not faith. Somewhat. Okay, that they decided to go ahead and give an idea more than just the word. But yes, I think that's what it is, the idea of visions. That they were intruding into visions or investigating visions. And that the difference there is, in the word, is were they reading about these visions or claiming to have had these visions? And either one is actually possible. Equally wrong, okay, but possible. Whether you have not in your text is whether, the only difference of how you understand it won't change that much in this instance. But the difference is whether it is Paul making a note of fact about it, that they haven't really seen anything, or is he just denoting the claim that they're making, which they have seen, intruding into things they have seen, or investigating things they've seen. So it's not real, it's just about perspective of whether he's saying that phrase from Paul's perspective or from these teachers' perspective. Okay. But that go ahead, John. Yes, a dream or not a dream, or you're wide awake and you say you've seen something. Okay. And then we're going to interpret it, okay? And that's what it is. Okay, now, this is where we're going. This is the second idea that goes with this, then. We've got something that has to do with angels, something that has to do with visions, okay? And then he describes this as vainly puffed up by his fleshly mind. And this is the third participle. The first has to do with the taking delight. The second is the intruding, and now actually puffed up, or vainly puffed up, is also the idea of a participle. It's the third idea. So now we're getting down to the way they're acting, of thinking they are somebody, right? So this is a different kind of way he's saying it, but they are puffed up. The word is without good reason. So it says vainly. They don't have a good reason. They all got the big head, is what they're saying about this, okay? They all got the big head about this because they think there's somebody. Why? Because of the fleshly mind, or the mind of the flesh, which the flesh most likely is indicating the things, the topics, and the things that they are investigating, and things that matter to them. Okay? Now, so not flesh in this sense, the things that appeal to the flesh. Now, we're going to wait, but I want you to note first in verse 19, and not holding fast, that's the next participle. Those are all connected. He's talking about what comes from these people who are cheating you of your reward. He's describing what's going on for them. They're wanting to develop this thing about angels. They're wanting to, in some way, involve visions, either a claim of it or they've got all the answers for these visions. They want to puff themselves up, make themselves look big and important. And when in doing so, they are loosening their grip on Christ. So we'll come back to that in a moment. But now you get the ideas, especially the two. When you have the idea of angels and some kind of visions, those things, number one, immediately say it has a Pharisaic origin. Since the Sadducees did not believe in the spirit world, and because the writing and most of that kind of the study, the Essenes did some, but mostly that was Pharisees doing all this writing during the intertestamental period. But we need to figure out what the vision part adds to this. Okay? So, there were two types of mysticism among the Jews that would qualify as philosophy for them. Two types that existed during the first century. Okay? One was apocalyptic mysticism. And that's the one that would have emphasized a lot of the apocalypses of the pseudepigrapha. Okay? So, apocalypses of the pseudepigrapha. All right. The pseudepigrapha, no, I need to explain this every time. It is fine. The pseudepigrapha is a collection of writings of the Jews during the intertestamental period. Okay, this is called Second Temple Judaism, if you have people talk about it. So from the time which they include from Ezra on, but really it's after the close of the canon. All these writings from, say, after Malachi's prophecy in around 400, everything that was written after that, and especially do you see a lot of it, most of them are coming up during the period of Hellenization, that is after when they were pushed to be Hellenized by Antiochus Epiphanes, and you have the Jewish rebellion at that time, the Maccabean revolt. You have a lot of this writing come out, but it's justifying their Judaism within, especially for Hellenized Judaism. So they're writing in Greek, they have Greek customs, and a lot of their ideas are, say, Greek or Jewish versions of Greek myths. That's you get a lot of that in this writing. Okay, that's part of this. But so that's part of this. But there's another part of it too. So you have the apocalypse part, but you have another thread as well that most people think was a response, whereas apocalyptic mysticism, kind of all the writings fell in line in some kind of trying to outdo Daniel, okay? Build upon that. Whereas the second kind of mysticism they usually go to for Ezekiel, if you go to Ezekiel 1, and you have this, if you read it for the first time, it's a wild vision of, God some form coming down in a chariot with wheel within a wheel and fire, and you're coming around and you're moving, everything's moving around, and this is what he's seen. Okay? Things that are associated with the heavens, whereas apocalyptic mysticism had more of a focus of things on the earth. And that is, you'd say end times is that's where a lot of people still get it. Okay? So here's what God's doing now. Because Daniel was a book about what was going to happen on the earth, on the governments and stuff, right? That's what the whole second half is about. And the interactions with government. Whereas Ezekiel was far more concerned in its presentation with more of a spiritualized kind of thing. Okay? Now, the mystics and the Jews that took that form, that would be called Merkava mysticism. M-E-R-K-I-B-A. Okay. It's M-E-R-K-I, and it could be B or V because of the way people pronounce the bet, A-H in English. So you have these dual strands of mysticism. I'm looking at y'all and y'all thinking, you never know what you're going to hear when you come to Kevin's class. I know. This was not on, you didn't have this written down to get. But the idea of visions was very much part of the idea of Merkaba mysticism. Now, they were still attached to a lot of these things going on and Jewish tradition of different forms, that they did have all this stuff that was in the pseudepigrapha. It just depended upon what you emphasized. Okay? And it also, I was telling Tracy beforehand, and I haven't done the work on this, I'm just going to give it as an illustration, okay? When you see all the references in Ephesians, how many times it uses the term heavenlies? Or if you go back in 2 Corinthians, which was written around 57, maybe as late as 58 AD, okay, which is just a couple of 2 or 3 years before Colossians was written. You remember when Paul talks about going up, he knew a man, and he didn't know if he was in the body or out of the body. He was taken up into the third heaven. But he could not. He said essentially saw things that were indescribable. So Paul, that experience was actually the type of thing that some of these Merkabah people would write about. It was being lifted up and seeing visions of heaven, and then they're writing about that. Whereas Paul actually was lifted up and said he couldn't write about it. All right? Kind of interesting what's found there in the Bible sometimes. Just say, tweak, okay. David.
Kind of turn that into a cottage industry and telling people about it, making money.
Yeah. I don't even know how much it was I don't know if it was specifically the money or the following, because those kind of go together somewhat. But sure. Well, you just get your own brand, right? Now you do it on YouTube. All right? But they had to travel to do it. Yes. It would be similar, yes. She was asking about its relationship with Mormonism, with an angel and a vision and the tablets and that stuff. Ron. No. Well, something that is really that specific like this, probably not. Something that's similar and has portions of it, yeah. Anybody who's going to go around and make claims that they had some modern day revelation, which is what Tracy is referring to, and that's why you get a lot of the groups that came out of the early 19th century, which is Mormonism was one, Seventh-day Adventism, later Jehovah's Witnesses, they all have that as their origin story. It's very much, that kind of thing. And it's the idea of mysticism, which is there are secret things that they know that no one else knows, right? Masons. Okay? All this is very simple. And it would be my argument, very likelihood, that this is also the origin point that we're not there yet, but after this is hard to prove because we don't have the documentation for it. But after the destruction of Jerusalem, you see some of these things reappear in different forms of this kind of thing in Gnosticism later on, which is why a lot of people earlier on thought that Colossians was written about Gnosticism. Okay? All right, so I'm not sure how far down the rabbit hole we just went, but it was a good ways, but I'm going to circle back around now. Okay. You understand how important it is to get that kind of background, though, to understand the problem. Okay. So, and it also explains, though, why he separated verse 16 and 18 in denoting the things that they were teaching and requiring. Because you have one which he is talking about that is of a shadow and a substance. There's a legitimate relationship between those things that were in the law and Christ, and then he separated those for the things that had nothing to do, that didn't come from the law and had nothing to do with Christ. That they were all these kind of own human additions ideas. Okay? They were all about the people. They had basically created these things. And the warning is, of course, that a lot of these things about the angels was incorporated into the Jewish tradition, was incorporated into Catholic tradition, which was absorbed into Protestant tradition, and is actually the foundation for a lot of what general angelology will get in systematic theology is today. That it has its roots in this stuff. Okay? John.
Explain all this to them. Did you say that they were very easily deceived?
I don't think it's ever fair to say that someone else is fairly easily deceived, because you don't know their background. You don't know how the nature of the argument is. And remember, these are young Christians. They've not been Christians very long. How much are we expecting of them to be able to discern? Because we're trying to say something. You're talking about people who would have been familiar with this. He was a Jew. Yes, the law talks about him. The Old Testament talks about Jesus. They're bringing in that the law, that was a Jewish book. They're coming in and talking about things from Jewish books. They're Jews. See, there are reasons why. In the same way that don't be hard on people in the world who are wrong spiritually. You don't know why they're wrong spiritually. That's all they may have heard before. Okay? And so we need to make sure that we are considering that. But it was serious because Paul was concerned. But he wanted to provide them with a proper understanding of a way to understand these people. These people are not your friends. Okay? That's why he's writing. And he's saying, here's what they're doing. They're creating this whole system of angels for their own benefit, as part of their own kind of religion, essentially, is what he is saying. They're entreating things to say they don't know what they're talking about when they talk about these visions, whether it is their explanation of some writing or their claims of making visions. Either one, they don't know what they're doing. I haven't authorized that. Paul said, I haven't done that. God didn't do that. This is all about them trying to act and want to be treated as if they're bigwigs. That's what this is. Okay? So verse 19. And not holding fast to the head. If they're not holding fast to the head, and he's talking about, in this series, a description of the people who were cheating you, what does that tell you about them then? If they were not holding fast to the head. So say it louder. Okay, they were Christians who are Jews who have fallen into this stuff and are trying to pull others with them. If we take this as saying, here's what's going on, unless you're going to go all the way back and say cheat you and not holding fast being the basis of it, okay? The idea of the not holding, that's a word means with all your might, okay? That is, you should be keeping a tight grip. Is this not happening? You're not holding on to the head. Okay, and now he's going to describe why you should, essentially. The reasons why. If we've got this, you're not holding on to the head, okay, and you're going through all this, and he says, from whom all the body, he's already described this, remember, going back to chapter 1. Because in chapter 1 of verse 18, and he, that is Jesus, is the head of the body, the church. So that's your context for when he says this, not holding fast to the head. Jesus, not holding on to Jesus, from whom all the body, that's the church. So remember how many times he's saying all the body? He's including them in the big picture. That's again important. All the body, nourished and knit together by joints and ligaments. Now that's interesting itself. Nourished, that is, that's how everything that's running through your system, okay, is ultimately gaining, no matter what part you are, from what the head is doing in terms of providing that, and it's getting the nourishment, okay? And in that way, you take the head away, how are you going to eat? So you're nourished and then knit together. Okay? So all the ways in which the body is tied together. And it's interesting that he adds, just for the illustration of joints and ligaments. What's the relationship between joints and ligaments? Okay, the joint is where everything comes together, but ligaments are what tie it together, right? Okay? Because there's not like what we would, if we were putting together a body, we'd have a leg together, we just have the two parts, and we put them together like that, we drill in there and put a bolt, right? Well, even when we do it again, we try to copy the human body rather and have the space in between, right? Rather than just direct on direct. We don't do it that way. Okay. He's noting that, but it's the whole idea that those parts matter to tie everything together. Okay? So things that would typically, you can locate a separate bone. They aren't connected, right? But they're all important. And this is what connects all those things with this end in mind. Grows with the increase that is from God. Here's the ultimate end of what is designed for the body, is for it to grow. And it's the same word when it says, same word group when it says grows. It's like increases with the increase of God, or grows with the growth of God. The whole idea is that once you cut off Jesus as your head, which is the design for what everything else goes, the authority for what's going to happen, for what you believe, so now we're spiritually, for where you get your information and nourishment. Once you're trying to go to a different source, don't expect growth. You're not going to increase with the increase of God doing that. And that's what he's getting across. All right, that was some... All right, interesting, strange, weird. You can pick your adjective description. But we will pick up there next week.